When it comes to filming multiple interviews for the same project, there's always that tricky balance. How do you make each setup feel unique, but still consistent and familiar? Well, today I'll walk you through my latest project, the lighting setups I use, the exposure choices that I've made, and the details that really tied it all together. Let's dive right in. My latest project was a corporate film where I needed to interview 6 different people for the same video. And so it's always a challenge to make each shot unique, but yet feel like they belong to the same project. In this situation, I have 6 people, but I'm not going to do 6 setup, because if I have to do 6 different setup, it's going to take a very long time. I can probably switch a setup in 15 minutes, maybe less than that. If we have to do a full, like going to a different room, then it's a lot longer because we have to literally tear everything down, move somewhere else, and start over. If I'm just pivoting in this one location, then in 10 minutes I can be ready to go. And so in this particular example, we did 3 different setups, and they're all in the same room. And that allowed me to be a lot more efficient and to be able to create those 3 different variation of the same look. And my first question to you would be, when you look at those 3 shots, what are some of the things that make them connect together? What are some of the similarity, the continuity between those 3 shots? Obviously, we have this wall back there on this first setup, and we have it here in the second setup. And that's a great way to keep something familiar for the viewer, to anchor the viewer into your image. And we have the same thing with the coffee table here, same coffee table here. And we also have a little bit of the fireplace on this shot here. And obviously the fireplace is here. The main one that I think is interesting in those 3 shots is the window. That window is always in the shot. And it's a different window. It's on the other side of the fireplace. So there's the fireplace and 2 of those skinny windows. But by keeping that window in the shot, again, those are visual anchors that helps your viewers stay connected to what you're doing, to be able to identify certain things, to say, this looks familiar, even if they can't pick out the window, or in this case also, the flowers are here and here. And so they may not be able to pick all those other things, but overall, they know it looks familiar. They know that those shots connect, that they belong together. And so those are the little things that, as a creative person, you need to pay attention to. You need to walk into those rooms and try to give your viewers those visual anchors, so that it keeps that consistency. This is the first shot that I looked at. This was the one that I knew I liked. I liked the corner. So it's always better to shoot towards a corner when you shoot interviews. It just gives you a lot of creativity, and it creates depth by itself versus shooting towards a flat wall. And in this case, not only do we have depth through that corner, but we have a variety of texture, which I love. And for me, it's always nice to be able to mix the color temperature and use it. So if I can use practical lights, the lights are already in the room, to get a warmer tone to part of the room, then I think, again, it creates something less flat, a little bit more interesting, right? Like if that lamp was a 56K light bulb, it would just look very flat and not super interesting. And so by having them as warm lights, then I think it just adds a little bit to the element. Looking at this room, I also understand that, especially now that I've seen my subject, I understand that my shots are going to be very contrasty, meaning the room is very bright and my subjects are all wearing pretty dark clothes. Like if you look back at all the shots, everybody's wearing either black, a little bit of a dark blue, and then the dark purple. And so my shots are going to be very contrasty. We're going to have very bright highlights and then some very dark shadows. And I always say, you expose for the uncontrollable. In this particular case, I don't control those windows. So I have to balance those windows and my midtones, which is going to be the person's face. So I want my highlights, the windows, to be as high as possible without clipping. And I need to protect my shadows. I don't want to create noise in my shadows. And the only way for me to not blow out the window is to bring the levels down using my ND filter. And that's going to lower even more my shadows. And, shooting in S-Log3, I want my shadows to be recorded somewhere at like 15 IREs, 20 IREs, or else it's going to introduce some noise. So I decided to shoot what I call negative ISO, using my EI, lower it below native ISO. So putting my EI at 400, so one stop below native. And what that's going to do is it's going to kind of force me to overexpose everything a little bit. And it's going to give me a little bit more room as far as not having noise in those shadows. The only camera setting that you have at your disposal for exposure is ND filters, because the other camera settings you want to keep for creative decisions. So you walk into a room and you should make decisions on your camera settings based on the look that you're trying to achieve. So if I want a really shallow depth of field, then I know my aperture is going to be open. And if I have some lights like the ones on top of the table up here, some practicals that I don't really control, I may have to set my shutter speed to like 1/60th of a second to make sure that there's no flickers, for example. And so those are more creative decisions that then ties you down as far as like exposing the shot. And so now all you have left is ND filters to limit or allow more lights to come into the camera. So always start with some level of ND filters, maybe like an ND6, maybe a little higher, maybe an 8. That gives me a couple of step down, and then I can go up if I need to. So I put the ND filter on and kind of set my camera with a pretty wide open aperture so that I have my shallow depth of field. And then I just want to tweak it to make sure that those windows are somewhat balanced. Lighting is an interesting thing because it can be very complex, but the technique and the theory are very simple, and it's always the same thing. Every setup is the same principles. It's just applying different techniques to achieve the same principle. And so the goal in lighting is always to create separation between my highlights, my midtone, and my shadows. And really the best way is to raise the levels on midtones and highlights. I can use my false color on my monitor, turn my key light on, and raise the level on her face. So my key light is here, and I want to raise the levels so that on my false color, I can see right here on this side of her face and get to the levels that I want to get to, and still have separation between her face here and the window back here. So that's the first step in how I'm going to use lighting. The other main goal of lighting, we're understanding separation. We also need to create contrast. And when I talk about contrast, that's on her face. So we are trying to create contrast between her right side and her left side, her key side and her fill side. We don't want that to be fully flat. We want shadows on the camera side. So on this particular shot, I want shadows on this side of her face using what's called a negative. And so it's placing a black bounce board or a black cloth or anything that's going to prevent any light from reaching her face on that particular side. And that's what's creating this shadow that you see here. And I feel like that's a pretty good contrast. Like, this is not a dramatic piece, right? Like, this is not a murder mystery where I need to create something very, very dark and contrasty. But as long as I have difference between that side and this side, then I'm happy. It's not a flight shot. We typically like to use either a backlight or an edge light. And that's to create separation between your subject and the background. And that's the beauty of the tube. And it's mounted on a boom arm. And that's on a stand that goes to the ground. And that way I can really kind of control how I place it and where I place it, and control this really bright, sometimes harsh edge that you see here. So now that we have our lighting kind of set, and now we have our ratio between her key side and the fill side, I want to make sure that I can maintain the same ratio from setup to setup. And that's where the ND filter really helps, because I can adjust my ND filter and it will raise or lower the overall level, the brightness of the image, but it will maintain all those ratios because I'm taking away or letting more light in on the entire image. And so the ratios, the separation is going to stay the same, and you just kind of move it up and down on the waveform based on the exposure that you want. And so that's why using an ND filter here is very useful. At the end of the day, the reason all those three setups feel like they belong together, well, that comes down to consistency. I wasn't just thinking about each interview as its own, like separately. I was thinking about how they would all live side by side in the final project. And by shooting into those corners and repeating some of the small elements that we see in the shots in the background, then the composition felt like it was connected. And by locking in the lighting ratios and using the ND filters to keep consistency, then the look carry across all the different setup. And by lowering my EI, I was able to protect the shadows and keep the exposure balance, even in a very high contrast room. So that combination, the composition, the lighting, and the exposure, is what gave me variety, but also maintained the cohesion. Thank you for watching, and happy filming.